Every civilization that ever existed eventually ended, but some of them didn't wait to be destroyed. Some of them packed up everything they had, walked away, and were never seen again. We call it collapse, we call it mystery, but what if it was actually a choice? That question has haunted archaeologists, historians, and psychologists for over a century. And the answer, when you dig deep enough, lives entirely inside the human mind. Before we talk about ruins, we need to talk about what makes a group of people give up on a place they built with their own hands. Psychologists call it collective trauma response, the moment a shared identity becomes unbearable to maintain. When the cost of staying finally outweighs everything they've ever known, something breaks. And when it breaks collectively, entire worlds disappear. Let's start with the civilization that most people think they understand, and almost nobody actually does: the Maya. By 900 AD, the southern Maya lowlands, home to millions of people, were almost entirely abandoned. Not conquered, not killed off by plague, the cities were simply left. Excavations of the final occupation layers show something extraordinary. Everyday life, frozen mid-sentence. Pots still on hearths, unfinished carvings, grain storage rooms left partially full. For decades, the dominant theory was environmental collapse, drought, deforestation, a civilization that ate itself into the ground. But here's what that theory never fully explained. Why didn't they stay and fight for it? Humans always stay and fight for water. The more recent and far more disturbing answer involves something much closer to psychology than geology. Political legitimacy collapse. That's what researchers now believe triggered the abandonment, not just drought, but the complete psychological erosion of faith in leadership. When people stop believing that their king can make the rain fall, they stop building his temples, and then they leave. This isn't just ancient history. Psychologists have a name for this specific type of mass departure, and it happens far more often than you'd think. Researchers call it place identity disruption. When the land that shaped who you are becomes associated only with suffering, the mind begins to detach from it. But the Maya aren't even the most psychologically complex case. That title belongs to a group of people who vanished from the American Southwest and left almost everything behind on purpose. The Ancestral Puebloans spent 200 years building one of the most sophisticated urban complexes in pre-Columbian North America. Then, in the span of a single generation, they moved everything, not just themselves, their entire ceremonial and cultural infrastructure, gone. Archaeologists found deliberate burning of structures, doors sealed with stone, objects ritually broken before departure. This wasn't a panicked escape. This was a coordinated, psychologically intentional act of collective closure. Researchers found evidence of what they call ritual discard, the systematic smashing of sacred objects immediately before the community left for the last time. They were saying goodbye, not to each other, but to the identity of the place itself, to who they had been there. There's a concept in psychology called psychic numbing, the point where the weight of accumulated loss becomes so total that the mind simply disconnects. And when an entire civilization reaches that point simultaneously, that's when the maps go blank. That's when the cities go quiet. But here's the question that should be keeping you up at night. If they chose to leave, where did they choose to go? And more importantly, why did some of them choose to never be found? The Maya and the Ancestral Puebloans are fascinating, but they're not alone. Around 1200 BC, something happened that makes both of them look like a rehearsal. In the space of roughly 50 years, almost every major civilization on Earth simultaneously collapsed. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in human history. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, Ugarit, Cyprus, the Egyptian New Kingdom, all gone, destabilized, or radically transformed within a single human lifetime. The last recorded message from the city of Ugarit was a letter to a neighboring king. It said, "The enemy ships are here. They are attacking us. Save us." No reply ever came. The city was burned to the ground and never rebuilt. Never. In 3,000 years, no one chose to live there again. But here's what most people don't know about the Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't just destruction. Mixed into all that violence was something psychologists recognize immediately: mass voluntary exodus. Entire populations didn't wait for the enemy. They read the signs: economic collapse, failed harvests, political fracture, and they left before the end arrived. Psychologists studying refugee behavior recognize this pattern instantly. It's called anticipatory abandonment, leaving before the worst arrives, even when leaving means never coming back. Now here's where it gets truly strange, because some civilizations didn't leave because of war or drought or collapse. They left because of something far harder to explain. Çatalhöyük, 9,000 years ago, home to up to 8,000 people, one of the oldest and densest cities ever discovered. They buried their dead directly beneath the floors of their homes, generations of ancestors literally under their feet as they slept. For 2,000 years, they lived in this extraordinary city, and then, around 5700 BC, they walked away. No war, no climate disaster, no evidence of disease. Just gone. And what researchers found when they excavated the final occupation layer changed everything we thought we understood about why people leave. The final residents had replastered the walls. Freshly, they cleaned the floors. They sealed the burial pits of their ancestors with new plaster. Then they left. They prepared their homes for a guest who would never arrive. Or perhaps they were preparing them for themselves, in another life they imagined would continue somewhere else. Anthropologists studying voluntary abandonment across cultures have found a pattern that repeats with almost uncanny consistency. And it starts not with disaster, but with meaning. When a community loses its sense of shared meaning, the story they tell themselves about who they are and why their place in the world matters, everything else follows. The anthropologist Scott Ortman calls this community identity collapse. It's the moment when the answer to "who are we?" becomes genuinely unanswerable. And here's the terrifying part: it doesn't require catastrophe to trigger it. It can begin with something as quiet as a generation of young people who simply stop believing in the city around them. Researchers studying the abandonment of Pueblo Bonito, the great house at Chaco Canyon, found something in the tree rings that told a story of two parallel truths existing simultaneously. The tree rings showed drought, yes, but they also showed that the great building projects at Chaco continued throughout the worst drought years, getting more ambitious, not less. They were doubling down. Psychologically, the community was performing certainty it no longer felt, building bigger to convince themselves they were staying. Psychologists call this effort justification. The more you invest in something, the harder it becomes to admit that leaving is the right answer, until suddenly it becomes the only answer. And then they left. The last residents of Chaco Canyon departed sometime around 1150 AD. They carried their ceremonial objects with them, but they also left something behind that no one expected: cacao residue. In the middle of a drought-stricken desert canyon, the last residents of Chaco held a feast using cacao imported from hundreds of miles away in Mesoamerica. Then they left. A farewell feast. That's what the archaeology tells us. They didn't flee. They said goodbye to the place, to each other, to who they had been, and then they walked into the desert. Now we need to talk about what these cases, the Maya, the Puebloans, Çatalhöyük, all have in common at the level of human psychology, because the pattern, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. Stage 1, environmental or political stress begins. Not catastrophic yet, just persistent, like a low fever that never quite breaks. Stage 2, social cohesion fractures. The elites visibly lose legitimacy. Ceremonies become more elaborate as they become less believed, and the young begin to drift. Stage 3, and this is the one nobody talks about, comes a moment of collective psychological permission, an unspoken consensus that it is finally acceptable to stop pretending. But there is one civilization that took this further than anyone else. One that didn't just leave their city. They erased their own name from history, deliberately. The Indus Valley Civilization, 3,500 years before the birth of Christ. At its peak, larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. They had flush toilets, standardized brick sizes used across hundreds of miles, a writing system we still cannot read, and then silence. Around 1900 BC, the great cities of the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dhalavira, began to empty. And they did something that has no parallel in any other civilization's collapse. They didn't burn their cities, they didn't destroy their temples, they dismantled them, brick by brick, and they took the bricks with them. They were erasing themselves, not in defeat, but in deliberate, organized, psychologically intentional self-erasure. This is unprecedented in the ancient world. Archaeologists have found their artifacts dispersed across thousands of miles, in Mesopotamia, in Oman, in the Persian Gulf. They scattered themselves across the known world. But here is the question that has consumed researchers for decades. If they scattered everywhere, why did their script, their iconography, their entire visual identity simply stop? No evolution, no adaptation, just cessation. Some researchers now believe the Indus people didn't just leave their cities. They made a collective decision to stop being who they were, to shed their identity like a skin. In psychology, this is called identity foreclosure reversal. It's extraordinarily rare at the individual level. At the civilizational level, it may be completely unique. Now take everything we've looked at, the Maya, the Puebloans, Saddle-Huruk, the Indus, and ask yourself, what is the single thread that connects all of them? The thread isn't drought. It isn't invasion. It isn't disease. The thread is a moment when the psychological cost of maintaining a collective fiction became greater than the fear of the unknown. Think about what that actually means. An entire population, hundreds of thousands of people, collectively decided that the story they'd been living was no longer worth the suffering required to maintain it. And this is where modern psychology becomes genuinely alarming. Because the conditions that trigger this collective threshold, we can measure them. We can see them building, in real time. A 2019 study published in the journal Nature Human Behavior identified what researchers called the abandonment threshold, a measurable tipping point in social trust that precedes mass voluntary departure. The researchers found that when trust in shared institutions drops below a critical level, and when that drop is experienced simultaneously by a majority of a population, the community enters what they call a pre-departure cognitive state. In that state, people begin what psychologists call cognitive pre-departure, mentally leaving a place long before their feet do, planning, imagining, rehearsing the life after. Here's what makes this so extraordinary. In every documented case of civilizational abandonment, the physical departure came last. The psychological departure, the inner leaving, happened years, sometimes decades before. The buildings were still standing, the fields were still partially planted, the ceremonies were still being performed, but mentally, the population had already gone. And then, on a day that was probably not particularly different from any other day, someone made a decision, a small one, a quiet one, and the rest followed. One family, then their neighbors, then the next street, then the quarter, then the district, then the city. In some cases, this process unfolded over a single season. Archaeologists call this the fall-off gradient, the measurable archaeological evidence of departure radiating from a center point, and it matches the psychological model with eerie precision. But there is one final layer to this story, one that the archaeology alone cannot tell you, one that requires listening to the descendants of the people who left. Hopi oral tradition, the descendants of the Ancestral Puebloans, doesn't call what happened a collapse. They call it a migration, a planned, sacred, spiritually mandated relocation. They say their ancestors were told, by spiritual instruction, to keep moving until they found the center of the world. and they followed that instruction for generations. The Maya, too, have oral traditions that reframe what archaeology sees as collapse. In Kayich Maya accounts, the Great Departure is remembered as a return, going back to something older and truer than the cities. What if the word collapse is the wrong word entirely? What if it's a word imposed by people who stayed on the psychology of people who chose to go? Because here's the truth that archaeology is slowly, reluctantly arriving at. In almost every case of so-called civilizational collapse, the people didn't disappear. The cities did. The descendants of the Indus Valley Civilization are almost certainly living in South Asia today. The descendants of the Maya are very much present, over 6 million people, in Mexico and Central America. The descendants of the Ancestral Puebloans sit on their mesas in Arizona and New Mexico, looking at the same horizon their ancestors walked toward. So the civilizations didn't vanish. They transformed. They chose a different shape for themselves. And that choice, that extraordinary collective act of psychological will, is something we are only now beginning to understand. So now we arrive at the question this entire journey was always really about. Not why did they leave, but what does it mean that humans, across every continent, every era, every culture, have always carried inside them the capacity to collectively say, enough. We choose something different. Every civilization that has ever existed has eventually faced its own version of the threshold. The moment when the accumulated weight of what it has become presses harder than the fear of becoming something else entirely. The psychologist Carl Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Perhaps civilizations face the same terror at scale, and the ones that vanished were the ones brave enough or desperate enough to finally accept that who they had been was finished. We look at their empty cities and we feel the loss. We call it tragedy. We call it mystery. But maybe, just maybe, what we're actually feeling is recognition. Because somewhere in the part of us that is older than any civilization we've ever built, we know exactly what they did, and we know exactly why. The cities went quiet, the names were erased, the scripts fell silent, but the people, they kept walking, they always kept walking. They walked until they found a new story worth living inside, and then they built again. And so the question that has haunted this entire story, why did entire civilizations choose to vanish? Maybe its real answer is this: they didn't choose to vanish. They chose to become. The vanishing was just the door they walked through to get there. And that door, it has never really closed.